Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillah wa salatu wa salamu ala Sayyidina Rasulillah wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa man wala. Okay, thank you for coming. So today, inshallah, we're going to continue our discussion on sort of this concept, this idea of the narrative of extremists and the counter narrative. And today we're going to talk about this topic, the divine promise. Is there a... Okay. So before we jump into the topic, I'm going to do something similar to what I did last time. I'm going to begin with an image that will help summarize for us what it is that we're talking about. So many of you have seen an image like this. This is an image of a cockpit, of a plane. And if you look, there are all of these gauges. And all of these gauges, the job of the pilot and the co-captain and the navigator, the job of all of those people that sit here is to be able to look at all those gauges and understand what's happening around them to ensure that they're flying safely. So to us, this looks very messy. We have no idea what any of these mean. We're used to sort of a couple of gauges in our car. But the job of the captain is to understand what each and single one of these gauges means to be able to fly the plane safely. And that means being able to read these gauges even if they can't see out the window, because when you're flying, sometimes you fly through bad weather. So if you're sitting in the captain's seat in the cockpit, you might look out and not see anything. You might not see the stars, you might not see the moon, the sun, sunlight, anything. All you see is just sort of the clouds, this white cloud. But you have these gauges, you'll be able to tell if you're going in the right direction, if you're at the right altitude, if you're at the right speed, all of those things. That's the job of the captain. Now, what does that mean for us? As a person of faith, as a person that practices faith, in our case as Muslims, our job is to understand how do we read the things that are happening to us in our relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, in our relationship with our faith. So oftentimes we ask ourselves questions, why do bad things happen to us? Why do we suffer? Why are we the way we are? Why is there suffering in the Muslim world? Why do others who seem to not be morally good succeed, and people that are morally bad succeed, and people that are morally good don't succeed? Things like that. We ask ourselves these questions, and those questions for us are like these gauges. And I want you to reflect on that image, and we'll show it again at the end as we progress in this discussion, because they're related. In the series that I've been doing, this series, every session, every discussion is a concept that extremists use in name, except this one. So today is an exception. This concept of the divine promise, al-wa'd al-ilahi in Arabic, it's not necessarily a concept that you hear these extremists using. But rather, if you study them and if you read their writings and learn their pattern, you will deduce that this is a key interpretive tool that they use to justify most of their actions. So you're not going to find this concept in their literature or on their websites or in their talks. But if you reflect on what I'm going to share with you this afternoon, you will understand how this is a key interpretive tool that they use to read the gauges that we talked about earlier. The first thing I want to say is that this is a result of the extremist concept of al-jahiliyyah. And this concept, this extremist concept of al-jahiliyyah, I spoke about in the very first session. So for those that are following and things like that, I refer you to that discussion. And we're going to summarize it quickly, but I don't want to get into the details. And then the second thing is that this concept or this interpretive tool is a function of the concept of the saved group mentality. And I'm going to highlight that for you today. So these two previous discussion points are important to understand today. Just by way of review, what is this concept of jahiliyyah that I'm referring to? In Islamic parlance, when we use the word jahiliyyah, that is a reference to the time before the sending of the Prophet ﷺ in Mecca. We refer to the pre-Islamic era as the age of ignorance, because there was like a moral ignorance and things were upset economically, people were treated unfairly, and then the Prophet ﷺ was sent and commissioned with this message, and he helped to address some of these things. But extremists, they say that jahiliyyah is not a time period, but it's a condition. It's a condition that can exist at any time, any place, under any circumstance, until the end of time. If you read the writings, that's what they say. So their concept of this age of ignorance is, it's not like a reference to a certain time in the seerah when we discuss that, but rather it's a condition. And because it's a condition, they can apply it whenever they want, whenever they find that it's valid. This also leads them to this other conclusion, that Islam as an orthodox sort of faith no longer exists, because everyone has fallen into this state of ignorance. This is about Muslims, not about non-Muslims. So extremists, they say people like us, we're not really Muslims. We don't follow real Islam, but we follow some messed up version of it. And because of this, they argue that there is a constant struggle between us and them. So this is the extremist thinking. Our little group, we're right and everyone else is wrong. And usually, 9 times out of 10, the them is other Muslims, not sort of other people, but just other Muslims. So this is the concept of the jahiliyyah. Again, for details on like how this came, and I refer you to my previous discussion. As far as the saved group, this is a reference to the hadith in which the Prophet ﷺ, he says that the ummah, the community, will splinter into these various groups, and all of them are in the hellfire except the saved group. Okay? So this is the concept of the saved group comes from this hadith. And again, I spoke extensively about this before, so I refer you to the details there, but I just wanted to give you an idea of how they understand it. Now, when the Prophet ﷺ said, the hadith is used to refer to the ummah, it's used to refer to the wider community. But the extremists, they take this hadith and they make it apply to themselves. So they say, we are the saved group. We are this one group that's saved. Again, that reinforces the us, not the them. And the hadith, the first part of the hadith is common, and then the end of the hadith, all of them are in the hellfire, except there are different variations. So they only take 1 or 2 of those variations to make their meaning correct. But they forget that there are other variations at that end part of the hadith that when you look at them in totality, the Prophet ﷺ is referring to the wider community. That we are saved, inshallah, because we follow his sunnah, we follow his way, and things like that. So they give it this narrow understanding. And they say, we are the saved group. So because Islam no longer exists, and because all of us are in a state of ignorance, and because there's only one group that's saved and it's them, there's this constant struggle. So this is the background mentality. So how does this impact sort of this discussion that we have on the saved, on the concept of the divine promise? Okay? So the first thing under this discussion or under this rubric is that they confuse the concept of faith and skills. What we say in Arabic is deen and tadayyun. All of us are required, as believing Muslims, all of us are required to have some level of faith. and some level of practice. We're supposed to pray 5 times a day, we're supposed to fast in Ramadan, pay our zakat, things like that. That's something that all of us have to do, men, women, old, young, etc. But that doesn't mean that we're all like scholars of the faith, or we're all skilled. But in their understanding, in extremist understanding, they conflate these two things and they misinterpret or they misplace the role of faith. And they say, because I have the correct Islam, this is them speaking now, because I have the correct Islam, I am therefore right, and then therefore all of the promises that God gives us in the Quran all apply to me and my group. That's why it's called the divine promise, al-wa'd al-ilahi. When God promises victory, when God promises relief, when God promises this, when God promises that, it applies to me. Not because I have the skills, but I have the right faith. But you see, God doesn't create the world just based on faith. You can't build a building or a bridge just because you have faith. You have to have skills. You have to know the right thing. You can't treat somebody, if you're a physician, just because you have faith. Right? You have to have the skills. You have to be trained. And you can have that training and have no faith. And you can have that training and you can have a lot of faith. But they're two separate things. And that's really important, because oftentimes as Muslims, we sometimes ourselves in our day-to-day life, our Islamic life, we kind of make this mistake often. The person who's pious, who reads Quran a lot and prays a lot and things like that, that person is not a scholar. That's a sign of religiosity. That's a sign of their faith, that they're connected. That's great for them. But that does not mean that they are qualified, that they have the right skills to answer the questions that maybe are facing the community. That requires a different skill set. Okay, so that's very important that we remember that there's a difference between skills and there's a difference between faith. I mean, hopefully, inshallah, we have both. But it's just the sunnah of the world, the way that God created the world. The other thing about this concept is that with this idea of the divine promise, these extremists justify their constant struggle. Because these extremists, they have a very, very tough life. They're always moving from place to place, they're always fighting, they're always on the run. Many of them are incarcerated. They have a very tough life. So this belief that I'm right and it's us against them and we're saved and there's some divine promise in the future, some goodness is going to happen to me, this justifies that they're constantly in struggle. So they wouldn't see, for example, the fact that they're always losing, or the fact that they've never won, or the fact that they've had failure after failure. They would not see that as a sign. Again, the gauges, they wouldn't read that gauge and say, oh, I'm in trouble. They look at that and they're like, that's a sign that I'm right. Because the sign of the divine promise is that there's constant struggle, always struggle, always struggle. So their failure almost justifies and reinforces their false belief all the time. And for them, this is an absolute belief. This is like the level of when we say La ilaha illallah, like we have absolute belief that there's one God, right? That's the core tenet of our faith. For them, this concept of the divine promise, that it applies to them, that there's no Islam, that they have the right Islam, that they're the saved group, all of these things, for them it's an article of absolute faith. And were you to talk with them about this, they would interpret your criticism as a sign of disbelief. Because for them, it is an article of faith. Like they wouldn't see it as like some difference of opinion. And if one of those people heard me in this presentation, they would say that this is a sign of my disbelief. Because I do not believe that, and this is me speaking, I do not believe that the Muslim community is in a state of ignorance. I do not believe that there's only one little group that's right and all of us are wrong. I do not believe in that narrative for reasons that I've discussed before. So they would see this as a sign that I don't believe. So you see how they stack the gauges up for them. So when they look in their dashboard and they see their gauges are reading to them that I'm right and you are wrong, that the fact that I'm constantly in struggle is good, and inshallah at some magic moment in the future, I will have this divine promise. It will happen to me and it won't happen to you. So how do they implement this? I mean, some of you are smiling, but believe it or not, I've sat with some of these people before, and this is actually how they think. And we'll get into it. I'll give you some examples. How do they implement this tool? What does this mean for them, this divine promise? The first thing is that they inculcate in their followers this strong notion of extreme patience. You know, Allah says in the Quran, وَصَبْرٌ جَمِيلٌ. About Job, He says that Job alayhi salam had a beautiful patience. That you have to be patient. This is part of our faith. So they take this, you know, they're very good at like taking what they want to make the gauges that they want and the narrative that they want. But they take this concept of patience, and because, you know, they're a complete failure, these extremist groups from the beginning, from when they started till now, it's one failure after, for, you know, over 100 years, they have been a nothing but failure. Imagine if you started a business and your family started a business and for 100 years you were failing. You know, it wouldn't last that long. There would be no such business. It would fail in a year or two and then you would move on. But they have failed year after year, event after event, opportunity after opportunity. And they justify this because they have this concept of extreme patience. They're like, oh, the divine promise, we gotta be patient. We're not gonna see it now, the next generation, maybe 5 generations from now, we'll see our hard work today. And all of these things have kernels of truth. Because in the work that I do, for example, I always remind myself that inshallah, I'm doing this not just for me, but I'm doing this for the future. I want the world to be a better place because of something small that I was able to do. That's a healthy way of thinking. So that concept in and of itself is not bad. But they are able to justify their constant failure because their rhetoric is always shrouded with this extreme idea of patience. And because they're always in trouble and they're always on the run and they're always being hunted and they're always in and out of jail, all of these things, their hardship becomes a sign of their success. So when you read like the ISIS people, for example, if you read about some of the top couple people, because they write about each other, they are presented to the public as heroes because of all of the struggles and the torture and the jail time that they did. The longer you've been incarcerated, the more you've been persecuted, the higher in the ranks you are amongst these people. Imagine that, you know, the most persecuted, the most ill-treated amongst us, we make this person our leader. They don't reflect, or maybe we did something wrong, or maybe this fact that we've never succeeded in anything we've said is a sign that we're wrong. They don't see that. But they interpret that as a sign of respect. Oh, this guy, he was in jail for 20 years under the Americans in Iraq. This guy was jailed by, you know, for 10 years by the Israelis. This guy, and they talk about this as almost like it's a badge of honor, or it's like some kind of rank that they have achieved. So their hardships become a sign of success. You see how it fuels itself. For us, you know, what I call normative Muslims, if we do something and it doesn't work, we reflect, well, why didn't that work? Maybe we need to change something. For them, it's the opposite. It's almost like they're setting themselves up to fail because they have never anticipated what it would be like if they succeeded. How can they establish this perfect Islam that no longer exists? How can they establish this utopian Islamic state under a Khalifa? They've never really thought about this because they know deep down inside that it's never going to happen. So it's like almost that they are anticipating that they will constantly fail. And then the most important is that they have infused this concept with the concept of tamkeen and political power. Meaning, and tamkeen is an Arabic word that comes from some of our sources that talks about arriving at earthly and political power. So, everything that they do is somehow aimed at arriving at political power. If you look throughout the Muslim world where there are Muslim majority countries, all of these Islamic groups, they form political parties. They hardly form charities or hospitals or anything like that, or any civil society. But you find them always running for office. Lower parliament, upper parliament, this syndicate, that syndicate, Senate, those kind of things, even the head of state. They're always in the political scene because they are using the democratic processes that exist in those countries to arrive at political power. Because political power is the only way, they argue, that we can fulfill this divine promise. The only way that we can correct our ignorance. The only way that we can bring back Islam. Which is the exact opposite of the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ. That wasn't his way at all. We follow him proudly. That's why we're called Sunni Muslims. We're very proud that we follow the Prophet ﷺ. It's a source of love and energy for us. He struggled patiently for 13 years. And he tried everything in his power to avoid the persecution, to avoid the bloodshed. He even left his home. Right? We know the broad strokes of the seerah of the Prophet ﷺ. And all throughout that time, he was building his community. It was from the ground up. That's how a real community is built. These people, they don't want to do that. They want to do the exact opposite. They want to come from the top and magically everything will fix itself in the middle and in the bottom. So everything that they do is politically motivated, power motivated. And these things like tamkeen, they use these words in their literature, in their discourse. So I didn't want to talk about that because I wanted to explain the background. Why do they use this? Why are they so obsessed with this? They don't care about democracy or this form of political government or that form. They're going to use whatever tools they have, even violence, to arrive at political power. Because they have narrowed the divine promise that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talks about in the Quran to being only a manifestation of power. They don't ever pause and think maybe there's peace in the community. That's a manifestation. That we're safely gathered together, that's a manifestation of these promises. They don't ever think about that. They read these things literally as meaning political power. So that becomes their ultimate goal. And they don't care about the things that we care about, actually helping people. I mean, think about that. They control no charities, hospitals, schools, civil society, the things that make society strong. They don't care. Very, very rarely do they involve themselves in that. But politics and elections and this and that and violence, that's where you find them. So I leave you with the image again of the cockpit. The gauges that we use, or in this case that the captain uses to fly the plane, to read what's happening, to understand the turbulence that they're experiencing, to make sure they're going in the right direction, to make sure that the altitude is right, that the fuel is enough, that they're not too much this way, they're not too much that way. If they veer off course, they can find a way back on course. Only by reading these gauges will the plane arrive safely. And if we do not have the tools, last time we talked about the language of Islam, today I'm talking about the tools. If we do not have the tools and the gauges to read what's happening to us and how we can interpret what's happening to us and implement it positively in a way that it's in accordance with the normative teachings of our faith, we will end up with a warped parallel religion, the way that these extremists have. We will misread the verses, misread the hadith, misread the events. Maybe the reason we keep failing is because we're doing something wrong. Not because because it justifies our struggle. If we were building a mosque and we keep failing the permit phase, we're not going to go to the county and be like, this is our divine promise. No, we're going to tell us what we did wrong and we'll fix it. You need this light here, you need that here, extra foot here. We'll do it. Pave this, pave that. We'll do it to pass the permit. And I know I say this example because we all know what that means, to get our facilities up and running. So it's very important that we build in ourselves, particularly the young people in our communities, the capacity to read the gauges right. So we understand what's happening to us and how to react to them. These people, unfortunately, they have taken certain things from our texts and our sources and our history, and they've given them new meaning. They've injected new meaning into them. And they have deduced from them very horrible conclusions that are really, to be blunt, are heretical. They're heretical conclusions. This is not what the Prophet ﷺ taught us or the ulama before us. So I want to stop there, and I want to, if there are any questions or comments, or if anything I said was not clear, I'd like you to use this opportunity to clarify that. And thank you for listening.